Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. And this was a really juicy question, possibly controversial, but in any case, a good question, a serious question, and a smart one. A viewer asks, have the Mahler symphonies replaced Beethoven's as the iconic exemplars of what the symphony ought to be? Well, that's a tough one to answer, isn't it? Well, it's easy and it's difficult. Let's see, what is the case for the positive? The case for the positive, that is the affirmative answer, that Mahler has replaced Beethoven, to a certain degree anyway, is that, first of all, the Mahler symphonies are ubiquitous. They are played constantly by everybody, everywhere. All of them are firmly ensconced in the symphonic repertoire, all of them, which is really pretty remarkable. I mean, there aren't a lot of composers who wrote a batch of symphonies where all of them are really seriously in the repertoire. And it's rather remarkable when you consider the range of symphonies that Mahler wrote. You've got the first, which is sort of jolly and youthful and triumphant. You've got the ninth, which is, sort of decadent and world-weary and death-obsessed and really a challenging work, which is yet extraordinarily popular. You've got the eighth, which is expensive as hell and really difficult, the one that heavy-duty Mahler people tend not to like because it's very populist and crowd-pleasing. It's really remarkable. You've got the sixth, which is tragic with its sledgehammers, the seventh, which is spooky and weird, and probably the least popular of them all, although it gets played a lot. It's an amazing thing that these symphonies have been accepted, given their range, the extraordinary range that they reveal. And they are arguably more consistent across their range, although they're as different as can be, one to the next, but they're more consistent across the range in terms of their popularity in play than Beethoven's are. I mean, remember, when everyone was trying to get a Beethoven cycle by Furtwängler, they couldn't find him doing the second symphony. I mean, Beethoven symphonies 1, 2, 4, and 8 are simply not as popular as the rest, and they don't get played with the same frequency. So there is that. I mean, it's absolute evidence that the Mahler symphonies, if you take them purely in terms of their playability percentages, are probably at a higher level than Beethoven's in some respect. And like I said, given the expense and the complexity, it's really kind of amazing. But the other thing in Mahler's favor, I think, is that Mahler's symphonies were really written to show off the capabilities of the modern symphony orchestra in the way that Beethoven's were not, obviously, from a purely chronological point of view. Beethoven had to deal with what he had to deal with. By the time Mahler was writing, the modern symphony orchestra had been around for about half a century, and most of your major metropolises had freestanding full-time orchestras, and Mahler wrote for the largest and most complex and various exemplars of those orchestras that he could get his hands on. So they are ideal in that sense. And of course, modern orchestras have taken advantage of them because doing a Mahler symphony really allows them the opportunity to show off. A bunch of them are also big enough and long enough that they fill up a whole program all by themselves. So you don't have to have a concerto and a thing and an overture and whatnot. You just do the Mahler symphony. And it's also worth pointing out that works such as the Second Symphony have become every bit as celebratory and hallmarks of special occasions like, state funerals and things like that as Beethoven's Ninth. And because the Second Symphony is actually heavily influenced by the Beethoven, you have a wonderful sort of natural succession from one to the next. So all of those things count in Mahler's favor. I mean, his enormous popularity and the frequency of performance and the acceptance of the entire oeuvre into the repertoire and all of those things. So the answer is no. Mahler symphonies have not eclipsed Beethoven's. They haven't. I don't think there's really any comparison, to be honest. I'm not talking about quality. I'm not talking about quality at all. And I love Mahler. I really do. I mean, you know that. I wrote a book about him. I wrote a book about Beethoven too. But Mahler, two books about Beethoven, actually. Yeah, I did. Well, anyway, now that I think about it, I mean, you asked the question, Beethoven will remain entrenched. And that's and that's the reason, by the way. Not because he's better or worse or even frequency of performance or anything. It's because Beethoven is entrenched. And once something is entrenched, it doesn't become detrenched or distrenched or anti-trenched. It's very hard to untrench something once it's trenched. And you have to remember also that although Mahler is enormously popular with audiences and all conductors today have to perform it just about, that's a recent phenomenon. There were some very long time, very great conductors who would have nothing to do with Mahler. I mean, Toscanini, Furtwängler, they tangentially did something now and then, maybe. Celibidache famously refused to play Mahler. Günter Wand never got into Mahler. Leonard Slatkin doesn't do much Mahler, although the Mahler that he's done, the second, or at least one of the Mahlers that he's done, is pretty marvelous. But it's not a specialty. You can get away with saying, I'm not a Mahler person. I'm just not. We'll have guest conductors do that. You can't get away with not doing Beethoven. Not if you're a serious conductor. I mean, you really can't do it. And Beethoven's works are simply such a part of our musical culture, our musical life, our musical civilization, in a way that Mahler's aren't. I mean, Mahler was for many, many, many years a cult composer, and he escaped the cult. He got out of the ghetto, which is a great thing. But an obsession with Mahler in the way that we naturally just assume Beethoven's greatness is a given is still a cult phenomenon. It really is. I mean, nobody is going to compare Mahler to Beethoven and be taken very, very seriously by the vast majority of the music-loving world. Now, Mahler is still subject to a bit of prejudice. I mean, because he was Jewish, because he wrote, big, flashy romantic symphonies, people who regard him as decadent and derivative and all those things that you would never hear in connection with Beethoven. Beethoven's place in the pantheon is like Bach's. It's way up there. Mahler has been climbing up. I mean, he really is. Frankly, I think he deserves to be up there. I do. I really do. I think as a symphonist and a composer, he was one of the great geniuses in all of music. And so I'm not making the argument from a point of view of personal taste or personal preference. I'm just looking at the facts and seeing what's happening objectively. And I know that there are vast tracts of people who would object to Mahler's being, classed in the same category as Beethoven, but who wouldn't have any problem, saying that Beethoven is, the greatest thing since sliced bread. So the short answer to your question, and I hope this is a relatively short answer, is no. No, Mahler has not taken Beethoven's place. I'm sure he has in the hearts of some music lovers, and good for them. But he just hasn't. Beethoven has an unshakable place in our music life. But having said that, now comes the interesting denouement, let's just say, the coda to this particular sonata form discussion of the duality of Beethoven and Mahler, Beethoven and Mahler. Beethoven's position has been undermined, for sure. It's been undermined, not by Mahler, but from the other end, from the back, from the period instrument people who have been going crazy over Baroque music and up through Haydn and Mozart. Beethoven's position, I think, was undermined first by the Mozart year, when everybody just went bananas over Mozart. And what was it, 1992 or whatever it was? It was just one of those insane things where Beethoven was swamped by this surfeit of Mozart. Mozart, everything. Beethoven has been swamped by the period instrument Bach people who have managed to deify Bach in a way that Beethoven has never been. He's been diminished slightly, I think, by the cultification, if that's a word, of Beethoven as Beethoven the pianist, Beethoven's piano works, which have become almost a separate niche of the repertoire all by themselves. All of these things, the way that the music industry has fragmented, because Beethoven's achievement as a composer was based to a certain extent on his universality. It wasn't just the symphonies. It was the string quartets and the piano sonatas and all of the chamber works and things like that. They made him the universal composer par excellence. And that has been challenged. But it's been challenged by musical scholarship coming from the classical and Baroque periods, not from anything that came later. And I think the biggest strike against Beethoven, despite the fact that a lot of period instrument people have done Beethoven cycles, is that those Beethoven cycles have turned out to be, by and large, rather cookie-cutter-ish and small scale. They don't promote Beethoven as the composer of epic works. He's become sort of a guy of his own time, in his own place, and the universality has been taken away from him to a certain extent. And that may be why it was even possible for this viewer to ask if Mahler had taken Beethoven's place, because Beethoven's position is not quite what it was. It's been challenged and undermined in very, very interesting ways, but we need to know where that pressure is coming from. It's not from the enthusiasm for Mahler. It's from the scholarly work that has diminished Beethoven as a cultural figure. And I think that that's a fascinating phenomenon that really someone should, make the subject of their dissertation. The reducing, the minimizing of Beethoven, I think is really an interesting topic. But with all that said, Beethoven is still Beethoven. No question about it, none whatsoever. Most of all, and not least, because he is still the only composer who wrote a symphony,
the Ninth,
which is absolutely impossible to speak of or listen to or have anything to do with unless you are suitably accoutred in a jacket and tie, or at least a tie, if not the jacket. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.